Welcome, everybody. My name is Michael Chertoff, and I am the chairman of the Museum's Committee on Conscience. It's my privilege to welcome you to the launch of an important and timely report by our Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. The report is entitled, Our Generation is Gone, the Islamic State's Targeting of Iraqi Minorities in Ninewa. As we all know, over the last year and a half, the so-called Islamic State, or Daesh as it's sometimes called, has brutally targeted religious and ethnic minorities across northern Iraq and Syria. Islamic State fighters drove many of these communities into exile, uprooting lives and tearing apart social bonds that have tied families together for generations. The violence and brutality against these minority communities took place as the so-called Islamic State swept across northern Iraq, threatening the security of the Iraqi state and of the entire region. As this report vividly documents, there is an alignment between the mass atrocities and the acts of terrorism committed by those who are adherents to the radical ideology of the Islamic State. Last August, a U.S. military operation to protect Yazidi civilians targeted by the Islamic State reminded us that preventing genocide and mass atrocities is a core security interest of the United States of America. Despite these actions to protect this community, minorities and other civilians targeted by the Islamic State remain at risk of mass atrocities. That same belief in the importance of preventing atrocities must continue to animate our collective response to this crisis going forward. This report fulfills a central part of this institution's mandate, to be the voice that European Jews did not have in the 1930s and 1940s. Elie Wiesel, our founding chairman, described the museum as a living memorial, stating that a memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past. This guiding principle animates all of our work, and most especially our Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Let me just say on a personal note, I am very proud to be associated with this institution and very proud of the people, some of whom you'll hear from, who were involved in this mission to go on site and document the atrocities and crimes against humanity that have gone on and are still going on in the region. This, to me, is really the living meaning of this museum and why it's so important. And so it's now my pleasure to invite Cameron Hudson to come on up and give you a little bit more detail about this report. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to read from a sort of condensed version of some of the key findings, laying out the commission of crimes that have taken place in Iraq, and give you a presentation of some of the next steps that we see going forward in Iraq right now. Based upon the public record and private eyewitness accounts conducted via dozens of one-on-one interviews in September of this year in the affected region with eyewitnesses and their families, we believe the self-proclaimed Islamic State perpetrated crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing against Christian, Yazidi, Turkmen, Shabak, Sabian Mandian, and Kakai populations in the Nineveh province of northern Iraq between June and August of 2014. We also found that in addition to committing crimes against humanity and war crimes, the Islamic State perpetrated genocide against the Yazidi population living in Nineveh province in August of 2014. Those crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity are ongoing against the Yazidi population, as women and children who have been kidnapped in large numbers remain enslaved by their captors. The Islamic State's stated intent and patterns of violence against Shia Shabak and Shia Turkmen communities also raise serious concerns about the commission and future risk of genocide against these groups. We believe a further investigation of these crimes is required. Our report contends that the Islamic State perpetrated these crimes in accordance with its extremist religious ideology, targeting particular groups on the basis of their religious identity. Under the Islamic State's ideology, adherents of religions considered infidel or apostate, including the Yazidis, are to be converted or killed, and members of other religions, such as Christians, are to be subjected to expulsion, extortion, or forced conversion. In terms of the response to these crimes, we believe that there was an abundance of early warning signs of the potential for this type of violence in Iraq going back decades that has put minorities at particularly acute risk. These signs include a heightened pattern of mass atrocities perpetrated against Iraqi minorities by both Sunni and Shia extremists since 2003, chronic instability, sectarianism, and rampant impunity that ultimately allowed for the persecution of minorities and for extremism to fester in the region. This created conditions under which future atrocity crimes could be perpetrated. More recently, a strong Sunni extremist presence in the region, as well as confusion over whether the Iraqi government or Kurdish regional authorities were ultimately responsible for the protection of minorities in this region, created an environment where large and significant protection gaps existed for minority populations. These protection gaps and an insufficient self-defense ability meant that flight was the only option for these vulnerable and unprotected populations. In the period of our report, more than 800,000 civilians, representing the vast majority of religious minorities in the region, fled the province in the span of 3 months last summer. The early warning signs of potential atrocities and a recognition of the Islamic State's intent to destroy and displace minority populations went largely unnoticed or were misdiagnosed by local and international authorities. This meant that atrocity prevention strategies that could have mitigated the risk to these populations were not pursued. Going forward, winning the war against the Islamic State, but failing to prevent atrocities and provide adequate security to all Iraqis, we believe, will likely fuel future atrocities, a proliferation of armed actors, and continued conflict. We assert that when done effectively, both counterterrorism and atrocity prevention advance core U.S. national security interests, and that these goals must be seen as consistent and mutually reinforcing. News from the region today suggests that efforts have already begun to liberate Yazidi lands, with U.S. and Kurdish forces coordinating on an operation that would retake the Yazidi homeland of Sinjar. As operations like today's intended to liberate people from the Islamic State, we believe such responses must incorporate at their core an atrocity prevention framework that includes risk assessments of these vulnerable populations, a strategy to provide for the long-term physical protection of these vulnerable populations upon their ultimate return home, a commitment to address the root causes and drivers of conflict and atrocities in Iraq, and lastly, accountability for the crimes perpetrated by the Islamic State, as well as for state and state-aligned militias in the region. This is a summary of our findings. I would like to now introduce Naomi Kiekeler, the Deputy Director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Naomi is the lead author of our report and conducted field research and interviews that support and inform these findings. I'll turn it over to her to add insights from her time on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. I'd like to start by saying that the self-proclaimed Islamic State are not only terrorists, they are genocidaires. They are perpetrators of crimes against humanity and of ethnic cleansing. The Islamic State has targeted people, as Cameron mentioned, on the basis of their identity. And I'd like to share with you one particular story that reveals that. This is a story of Khalif. He is a Yazidi man. At the outset of the Islamic State's advance on the area of Sinjar in northern Iraq in August of 2014, Khalif was outside of Iraq because he had been living abroad for 18 years. He found out that his mother, his first wife, his 2 sisters were missing. They had either been kidnapped or killed by the Islamic State. and he returned to Iraq in the hopes that he could find his lost family members. What happened in the community that his family members were at is a very stark example of what genocide today looks like under the Islamic State. In the village of Kocho, 1,200 people lived for 12 days under the control of the Islamic State. With each passing day, there was a varying degree of control that was exacted by the Islamic State over them. At the beginning, they were told that they could live freely. Then they were told that their weapons would be taken from them. Then they were asked to convert. Then they were told they didn't need to convert. Finally, on the last day, they were told that they needed to meet at 11 o'clock at a school. When they got to the school, men and women were separated. Women were taken upstairs and divided into 3 groups: young women, women and children, and elderly women. Men were taken into one large room on the ground floor. After conversations with the Islamic State, the men believed that they would be released. Instead, they were taken carload by carload to be shot. And there today is only a handful of men who survived that experience. The women were also taken. We don't know what's happened to the elderly women. What we do know is that the young women and children and their mothers were taken to a nearby town, and that they were divided, and some were given as slaves, sex slaves, to Islamic State fighters. Many of those women remain unaccounted for. We don't know of the men if there are other survivors. We spoke to a small handful. But that entire village of only Yazidis today no longer exists. The Yazidis who survived live in displaced persons camps in Iraqi Kurdistan, where they are safe, but they cannot return home. The story of Khalaf is just one of many stories that was shared with us in the various camps that we visited, the makeshift shelters, and the homes that we were fortunate enough to be able to spend time with when we visited northern Iraq. The Islamic State, as Cameron mentioned, is targeting these populations on the basis of their identity. I spoke with a Shabak man who told me of his uncle. All they know is that his uncle was stopped by an Islamic State fighter and asked, "Are you Sunni or Shia?" He's reported to have answered, "What does it matter?" On the basis of his answer, he was taken by the Islamic State. We do not know today if he is alive or dead. The Islamic State is perpetrating these crimes because of the identity of the people that they're encountering. They're also perpetrating these crimes for strategic reasons: to seize land, to seize women, to secure income, to gain new fighters, to essentially control, expel, and exterminate. All Iraqis have suffered as a result of the Islamic State. Minorities, both Muslim and non-Muslim, Shias and Sunnis. Many Sunnis today live under the brutal control of the Islamic State, and we do not know the full extent of the atrocities that have been perpetrated against them. The focus of our report, however, was on minority communities living in northern Iraq. And the reason that we focused on them was because they were simply not a priority to the Iraqi government and to other relevant actors that had a responsibility to protect minorities in Iraq. We focused on them because they were also not adequately protected. As we all know, the sheer force of the Islamic State movement across northern Iraq was overwhelming, and that they overpowered the various security forces that were supposed to provide protection to these particular communities. Many of the people that I spoke to had merely a moment's notice to flee, and I'll share with you the story of this man. This is the story of Ibrahim. Ibrahim was a wealthy merchant from Mosul. He lived a life that was very similar to our lives. He had a home in Mosul and he had a home in Karakosh, which was one of the largest Christian cities in Iraq, the largest Christian city in Iraq. When the Islamic State took over Mosul in June, he sent his wife, his daughter, and his granddaughter away to Karakosh to be safe. He stayed because he hoped that he could live under the Islamic State and continue to run his business. And at the beginning, it looked like that perhaps may have been possible. However, on July 17th, the Islamic State made a proclamation and said that remaining Christians had to either convert, pay a tax, or leave. Ostensibly, if one of those three options were not taken, then they would be killed. Ibrahim went to try to pay the tax, but was told by the Islamic State that he could not. So as a result, on July 19th, he had to flee Mosul, as did the remaining Christian community. When he fled Mosul, the Islamic State stopped him at checkpoints, and they robbed him of his money, of his gold, of anything that was of value. So he was left destitute with nothing. He fled to Karakosh, and then from Karakosh had to flee again when the Islamic State took over Karakosh in August. Today, he lives in a container in Iraqi Kurdistan with other Christians who have been displaced from Mosul and Karakosh. His story was one of many that we heard that shared a similar experience of having to flee under these circumstances. They're living today in very difficult conditions. They're living in a situation where they face unprecedented uncertainty for them. They do not know what the future holds, and they do not know if they can return home or when they can return home, or if they will be protected when they return home. Today is in many ways a sad and solemn day. Thankfully, genocide and the commission of mass atrocities like crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing is rare. This is not something that we want to have to say on many occasions. It's not something that the international community should have to say happened today, 70 years after the Holocaust. This is a moment where we need to ensure that the voices of those who've experienced these crimes are heard, that this report helps to compel action to assist those at risk and those who remain in need. To also ensure that the American public and the world public understands what happened to the people in northern Iraq. I'll end by just sharing one last story, and that is of Elias. Elias was a survivor of Kocho, and when I met with him, he shared with me that he did not know where his sons were, save for one. He did not know where his mother was. He did not know where his wife was. He did not know where his sisters was. They're all missing. They've all either been killed or kidnapped by the Islamic State. And as I sat there, I thought of my own family's experiences, and I thought of 70 years ago when my grandfather lost his entire family in the Holocaust. We've made a commitment to making Never Again real. Today is a sad and solemn day because it is an example, unfortunately, of our failure to uphold that commitment to make Never Again real. We can do something, though, today, and Cameron has outlined many of the steps that can be taken to do so. We can assist those who have been kidnapped to ensure that they have the support that they require to lead lives and receive the treatment that they require. We can seek solutions to try to find ways to liberate those who are still being held. We can push for accountability and justice. One of the reasons that the Islamic State has been able to rise as it has is because of the pervasive culture of impunity that has existed in Iraq for decades. That must be put to a stop today. We can help by providing assistance to the hundreds of thousands of people that are displaced. And we can also help by ensuring that the communities that are going to be returning to their homes have the adequate physical protection that they need. And I think this is one example of Christian Kurdish Peshmerga, an example of a young man. When I asked him why he had joined the Peshmerga, he said it was because he felt that there was no one who could protect him and his family, and that he needed to provide that particular protection. In our effort to try to tell the stories of these individuals, we have released the report today, but we have also launched a remarkable website. And I'd like to share with you one of the voices of those that we met with, a Christian man by the name of Johanna, who was a professor in Karakosh before he was forced to flee with nothing other than the t-shirt that he was wearing that day and the clothes on him. He fled with his 85-year-old mother who had never left Karakosh. And he, I think, can say what what I can't say in a very, very eloquent way, because he's speaking obviously from the heart and from what he very much hopes for his own community. Thank you.
اليوم ليس لدينا حلولا إلا أن يكون لنا منطقة آمنة في شهرنا، أنه لم يعد لنا أي ثقة بأي قوة يمكن لها أن تحمي مناطقنا، لأنه حقيقة في وقت الأزمة ووقت الشدة لم يقم أحد بحمايتنا. لذلك اليوم أحد الشروط التي نريدها لعودتها إلى مناطقنا هي أولا الحماية الدولية، ثانيا أن تقوم الدولة بمحاسبة من تسبب في هذه الأحداث.
It's a pleasure and honor right now to introduce two people. First, to introduce Dakhil Shamo, who is a Yazidi human rights advocate and a Voice of America journalist here in Washington, D.C., and who played an integral role in engaging with the U.S. government and others during the period of the crisis that we've just discussed. Thank you, Dakhil.
Good morning, everyone. This is the day that Yazidi community in Iraq and everywhere in the world are waiting. Today, with this report, the releasing of this important report, there is the operation of liberation of Sinjar started. Before I came to this room, I was talking to some commanders, 2 or 3 commanders on the ground. ISIS has no any resist, and they are just leaving the area. All Kurdish forces are in advance. So 2 good news today, the report and the liberation operation. I think this is very important report that we are reading today, and the findings also. And I hope this will be a base for other efforts that taken by the NGOs, local governments, and US government, US Congress, and they will go back to this report and their findings when they talk about the genocide, because I know there are many efforts everywhere to recognize what happened to Yazidi community, to Christians, to other minorities in Ninewa province is a genocide. This report is important also because it is from a place that it is a memorial of genocide. And I would say it is a beginning and a first step to at least a work that we can do to respect the victims. But today, with this report releasing, and you will see all the findings, I'll have a hope that it will be, the other stuff will be very professionally done by the local governments, the local forces. First, with the liberation of Sinjar area, those forces will protect the places that genocides happen there. Kocho, the village that is a symbol of genocide, is still under ISIS. So, and everyone hopes that in a matter of days or maybe hours, Sinjar will be liberated and Kocho will be liberated and ISIS will not be there. So protecting this area and documenting these places is the most important thing. I hope the forces back there will consider this issue. Second, to put a mechanism to rescue those girls and children that still kidnapped by ISIS as enslaved, and they put in the markets as slaves. The third point that I hope that there will be no revenge in this process. This will be a step and a beginning that international community, ICC, will take steps, and those people who are responsible for these crimes will face justice. Thank you.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Margit Messner, who is a Holocaust survivor and a really powerful champion for genocide prevention and a role model for many of us here at the museum, to share her reflections. Thank you, Margit.
Good morning. As you heard, I am a Holocaust survivor and a volunteer here at the museum. It is therefore not surprising that I am appalled to hear that in 2014, genocide was perpetrated against the Yazidi people in Iraq, and that Christians and other minority communities were the victims of ethnic and religious cleansing. Over 70 years ago, the world vowed never again. Yet today, the world is again faced with a group, the self-proclaimed Islamic State, that is intent on destroying people based on their religion or their ethnicity. The crimes that the Islamic State committed should surprise few of us. Early warning signs were missed, despite ample warning from the US government and others, including the Islamic State itself. It broadcasts atrocities for the world to see on television, in newspapers, and online. When we witness crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, we must speak out. I am proud that today the museum is speaking out on behalf of Iraqi minorities. In doing so, we are doing what was not done on behalf of the Jews during the Holocaust, serving as a voice, calling for action, urging us all to transcend politics and to nurture compassion. It is of utmost importance that the museum's finding be publicized as widely as possible. Seeing men, women, and children in Iraq displaced from their homes and suffering must compel us to action. I know personally the devastating impact that genocide can have on communities and on individuals. We all have a responsibility to ensure that others are not, as the Jews of Europe were, and the Yazidis of Iraq are today, that they are targeted for genocide. Thank you. Where's my water?
That concludes the formal remarks that we had prepared. We're available to take any questions that you might have. I would just note that the report is now available in hard copy here and online, along with, as Naomi mentioned, a multimedia web experience that includes many of the photos that you've seen, in addition to others, along with video testimonies that will be available both on the website and separately at request for them. So with that, I think any of us would be willing to take any questions you have about the report or its findings or the experience of drafting. Yes. I'm sorry, we have a mic runner here as well.
David Hoffman from the Washington Post. I read the report, but could you fill us in a little bit on the details of your bearing witness investigation? How long were you in these areas? Where did you go? How many people did you interview? Just give us the scope of this inquiry.
So the Bearing Witness trip is something that the museum has conducted in many occasions to other places. Many of you might have seen our recent report on Burma, which was a Bearing Witness trip that our colleagues took there. I was in Northern Iraq for 2 weeks and went to meet with a range of actors. A large focus of the trip focused on meeting with displaced individuals themselves. We met with people who have been displaced from each of the communities that Cameron mentioned. We met them in IDP camps around Brookfield, Duhok, and elsewhere. We met them in rented homes. We met them in makeshift shelters. We also met with religious leaders, political leaders, or some of those particular groups. We met with representatives of the Kurdish regional government, with humanitarian human rights organizations, both domestic and international, and tried to, as much as possible, be as exhaustive as we could in our interviews to better understand the nature of the violence that had unfolded, the ongoing risks that these communities face, and also just the challenges that they are experiencing today in light of what happened to them 1 year ago.
Tom Ackerman with Al Jazeera English. You talked about both accountability and also you talked about accountability. And the last gentleman also mentioned the hope that there not be revenge. What instruments do you foresee could possibly accomplish the first without committing the second?
I'm saying that because those people that are participating, taking part of these operations are Yazidis. There are thousands of Yazidis there, men who lost their children, wives, sisters, daughters. And the entire international community knows what happened to them and how ISIS dealt with them and how they are doing that. So in that environment, we wish that those people or individuals, there would be no systematic act, but individuals, when they go to these areas, they will not think that they will take advantage. That's what I'm hoping. And this should be controlled by, I would say, all forces in the ground, government, regional governments, the leaders of the community back there, and they understand that. I've been with contact with them many times talking about that because there was an incident happened on, I think it was December, and they denied. They said it was in the media. We just free those children and women that we captured. But again, in the media, and especially in some Iraqi and Arabic media, we see that talking about the revenge, which did not happen. But still, we wish that those people that they lost their families. Can somebody imagine a man who has a gun in his hand and fighting, and for a year he lost 10 or 12 members of his family? So hopefully this will not be a time for revenge, because we as Yazidi community, as Yazidi religion, we are peace. I would say community people. We believe in peace and we believe in the living together. So that's what I'm hoping. When I say that, I mean individuals who lost their family members, not to think that they will go there to have some advantage of the upper hand of the military. So please don't understand me that there will be something like that. I'm sure it will not be systematic people, nothing but individuals who, as I said again and again, lost members, daughters, sisters, and a young one who knows that his mother is enslaved and was put on the market by ISIS. That's what I'm thinking.
Just to complement what Ezekiel said right now, in the report we highlight, as I mentioned, that we think there needs to be a series investment in efforts to address accountability gaps today. And I think that entails a number of things. There is right now a real paucity of efforts to document the crimes that have taken place in a systematic way in which the evidence gathered can actually be used for future prosecutions. There's been very little investment in actually preserving evidence. So mass graves, for example, have not had the care or any kind of security provision that they should have to ensure that material can be extracted from those graves and used for future prosecutions. Some of the mass graves are still under the hold of the Islamic State, and we simply don't know if they will be surrendered. A lot can be done to document and protect evidence at this particular time. We need to also ensure that the people who are doing that work have the necessary training so that these communities, especially women, are not re-traumatized in the process of their being interviewed for the purpose of future prosecutions. Prosecutions can happen, cases can happen domestically, although there are misgivings today about the independence and strength of the Iraqi judicial system. I think many survivors that we spoke to simply doubted that the Iraqi legal system today was equipped to deal with the crimes that were perpetrated by the Islamic State. They also questioned whether or not the Iraqi government had the political will to do so. As a result, the preference of many that we spoke to was for there to be international prosecution, either through the International Criminal Court or through third-party states. So, for example, there are foreign fighters who are American citizens, Swedish citizens, Canadian, German, who can be prosecuted domestically for crimes that they perpetrated in Iraq. And I think that that's another avenue that needs to be pursued. I think a very important point to stress that goes back to what Crystal said was what we need today is accountability not just for the crimes perpetrated by the Islamic State, but also accountability for crimes that are being perpetrated by all actors, including the various security forces that are involved in a counter-ISIS effort today. We have unfortunately seen that human rights violations have been perpetrated on the scale of mass atrocity crimes against populations in ethnic minority when taken by the Islamic State. We work on atrocity prevention, and what we have known through looking at past cases is that the commission of human rights violations, even in the name of trying to do something that many people will think is good, such as liberating land, will only feed future cycles of violence. And what we need to do today is to stop that cycle of violence, to address the grievances that are underpinning some of the actions that are unfolding in Iraq today. So it's important that there's accountability for all individuals. Great, thank you.
I would just add one point to that, and that is, rarely in a counterterrorism context do we talk about accountability. And I think that one of the things that we're hoping to achieve with this report is to inject into the policy discourse and the public discourse around the nature of the threat posed by the Islamic State. To be sure, it is a counterterrorism objective and a counterterror threat to the region and more broadly than that. But it's also a threat, as Naomi called them, genocidaires. These are a threat to the people of this region first and foremost. And if we are collectively viewing the Islamic State purely as a counterinsurgency or a counterterrorism operation, then we're missing opportunities to employ things like accountability, which are at the heart of any atrocity prevention efforts. Are any other questions? How about right here in the middle?
Thank you so much. Jason Calvi with EWT and the Catholic Network. Can you describe what the difference is between genocide and the crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and what the distinction is between that and how you got to both of those determinations? Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for that question. And you'll find kind of a more detailed analysis in the report. But very briefly, genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part particular groups. And under the 1948 Genocide Convention, those groups are defined, and they include, for example, religious groups, which is what we focused on here. In the course of the interviews that we did and the conversations that we had with various officials and trying to understand better the pattern of behavior by the Islamic State, it became very clear that the Islamic State has a kind of an extremist ideology whereby certain groups are to be treated in a particular manner based on their religious beliefs. And many of you are familiar with the notion of the people of the book. What became very clear was that Yazidis and others that were kind of regarded as infidels, were given essentially the option to convert or die. And I need to be very clear in saying that the vast majority of Yazidis survived this experience, but there are thousands of people who were kidnapped or killed. And that from the perspective of genocide, you don't need to destroy the entire group. It's the intent that is the critical factor. And in this particular case, that intent exists. The Yazidis were not deemed worthy of life as Yazidis in this particular case. For other communities, for example, the Christians, their plight was also very dire. As I mentioned, I shared that experience of Ibrahim, who was told to essentially either convert, leave, or pay the tax. And if he didn't do that, then the only thing that was left was essentially to face death. It's a slightly different treatment in that particular case for Christians than, say, for example, for Yazidis or Shia. And it goes back in part, our understanding is, to the ideology of the Islamic State and their puritanical interpretation of religious text. So that in part is one of the reasons why there's a differentiation in the crimes. We do feel that there has been a very distinct effort to cleanse that entire area of minorities, or to ensure that those very few minorities that do remain, or individuals that remain, are strictly under the control of the Islamic State and adhere to the tenets of the Islamic State. Thank you.
Right here.
My name's Jake Gibson. I'm with Fox News. I think earlier you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there was cases in which security forces had committed, atrocities. Are you talking about in this case in particular? And can you name them and kind of tell us what happened?
I'm happy to kind of briefly. I think I would suggest there are some really excellent reports that have been published by Human Rights Watch and others on, for example, the efforts around a town called Amerli and the commission of large-scale human rights violations there. Those crimes are perpetrated primarily by the Iraqi security forces and Shia-aligned militias. That is not in the particular area that we're talking about. We're talking about Nineveh. And in our report, one of the things that we highlight is we don't want to see a repetition of those same crimes that were committed in the name of counter-ISIS to a certain degree being perpetrated in Nineveh, because it will, again, only act to fuel future atrocities in the future. What Dakhil was speaking to was there are risks, and our report does highlight one particular example of there potentially being revenge killings. Some of the ground forces that are being used include community-based organizations. And I think, as Dakhil mentioned, there is a risk that some people may seek revenge. There have been some reports of Sunni Arabs being displaced or being killed in the course of efforts to liberate land. And from our perspective, as Cameron mentioned, in the course of any counterterrorism effort, we need to place the priority on protecting local populations, not simply removing the threat. In this particular case, the Islamic State are not just terrorists, they're also genocidaires. They are specifically targeting local populations for atrocity crimes, and our strategies need to reflect that particular reality.
With that one too, I just wanted to add another point to that issue. We receiving reports. It's been a few days that ISIS are moving the civilians from the area, and I would say this is a good thing, that civilian will be no affected by the conflicts. The second, the incidents that happened, it was in December that Yazidi were accused of some kind of revenge. After that, reports, Yazidi fighters denied that, and the supreme leaders of the Yazidis issued statements and asked people not to act this way, because we don't want to be another to be seen as a group that committing crimes and doing any violence, because we are, as a religion, as I say, very peace people. We believe in peace. So these two things that I hope it's going to help in this regard.
Any other questions? Yeah, over here.
I'd just like to come back to this genocide question again. By your definition, ISIS had the intent, and but did they commit a genocide here, or did they just have the intent? And how do you classify this as a genocide when compared to other large-scale displacements of people because of war and conflict? I'm thinking, for example, do you classify South Sudan as a place where genocide was carried out? What's the difference, especially given the context of the war? Is this a intent, or is this actually commission of genocide?
I'll maybe take the first part, and then on the South Sudan part, you can share your thoughts on that. It's a great question, and I think it's a really important question in light of the findings of the report. Our findings are that genocide was perpetrated, and that the intent existed, but also the acts were committed. And in the report, we outline some of those particular acts. I can give you a kind of short preview. So for example, there were 40,000 people who were trapped on Mount Sinjar. Mount Sinjar was encircled by the Islamic State. The Islamic State either tried to kill people who were getting onto Mount Sinjar or deny any access to food, water, or any basic material that would have been needed to sustain life. In that particular effort, they were specifically targeting the Yazidi community. We have a number of different accounts of communities like Kocho, for example, where there were massacres specifically targeting Yazidi communities. We have examples of Yazidi women, children being kidnapped and forced to convert, becoming sex slaves. Each of those different acts, when you go through constructing kind of what a genocide determination looks like, fulfills different components of the genocide convention. And from our perspective, meets the threshold and meets the threshold of the experts that we've worked with on this as well. Because we didn't just see the intent, we actually saw acts representing that intent. And then we also saw statements from the Islamic State and from their various propaganda outlets explaining and affirming their actions being taken in accordance with their extremist ideology. From the perspective of genocide, it's really important to underscore, we talk about genocide and we often tend to think about the Holocaust or Rwanda, in part because of the scale, especially with the Holocaust, the systematic, methodological, large-scale murder of a people. When we look at other examples that are more recent, so for example, Srebrenica in Bosnia, in that particular case, the courts determined that genocide was perpetrated and it was 7,000 people that were killed. There is no actual numerical requirement when it comes to genocide. And I think that's one of the things we tend to misunderstand when we talk about genocide. So scale is not necessarily a requirement when we say that genocide has been perpetrated. In this case, we do believe that there have been thousands of victims of genocide who were the direct targets of the violence. The broader community has experienced genocide at this particular case. And that's one key kind of component to it. I think the report explains a little bit more on that point, maybe on Cameron on kind of the South Sudan type of example.
Well, yeah, I don't know that we want to sort of draw equivalency across time and space. And I think that there's an important distinction too to make, which is genocide is a legal definition. It's a legal term. It is a treaty convention. But we are not a judge and jury to adjudicate that in a court of law. It requires a court proceeding. I think what you'll find in the report is that we do try to unpack, as Naomi said, the various elements that contribute to genocide. So killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. All of these conditions we outline in the report as having been met with intent to commit these crimes by the Islamic State. But again, our hope is that this report prompts a conversation about this designation, prompts accountability actions, prompts others to look at this crime and this label. But just to reinforce, there is no, numerical level that that you need to reach, and that's one of the, I think, the challenges of talking about this right now, about this in the context of a counterterrorism operation, in the context of a non-state actor committing these crimes. Whereas before, I think, we're talking about a 1948 Convention on Genocide, which is predicated on the notion that only states commit these crimes. And so I think this is not a 20th century crime anymore. It's a 21st century crime, and that crime looks different today than it did 70 years ago. But the effect on civilian populations is the same. And that's the distinction that we're trying to make here. Please.
I would say this, as an AZD activist, and my community was affected by ISIS the most. The ISIS, when it comes, it wasn't like a group of terrorists is fighting a government or fighting other group. It was a different way in fighting. And when they come to Sinjar Mountain specifically, I will tell you what happened. More than 320,000 people of my community forced to leave their land. That's one. 7,000 people, civilian, were kidnapped. There is no specific number, but there are, I would say, more than 20 places that founded where ISIS committed crime, where a number of people, between 10 to maybe 50 people killed in one place. ISIS separated children from their parents. ISIS forced them to leave, as Naomi was mentioning, thousands of people to live in a condition where they have no access to even water to drink in that summer. So I don't know how to, I mean, there are a lot of evidence, and it is documented that what happened is genocide. Although I'm not a person that can decide or judge about that, but I think as a member of this community, it was a genocide from the first day. We say this is a genocide, and the international community has to act not only on the local level, but in the level of the international community, ICC, International Criminal Court, the European Union, the United Nations, US. They have to act. They have to do something, because it is, if you go and investigate, it is a genocide. It is genocide what happened to Yazidis. So the scales, I don't know whether it's how to define or how to compare it to what happened in Rwanda or in Bosnia or in the Holocaust in Europe against Jews. The scale, I will not compare them, but what happened is genocide in our views. And I think President Obama, first statement by President Obama in reaction to the ISIS attacks on the Yazidis, he mentioned the genocide in his statement. But it wasn't, the government won't that time say that what happened is genocide. But this report, I hope, as I said in my statement, I hope it will be the first step to recognize, to admit what happened to Yazidis, a genocide by all levels.
I think it's only appropriate that Dakhil Shamo has the last word on this. So I want to conclude that now. We'll be available afterwards to continue the conversation, but I wanted to thank everyone on behalf of the museum for turning out for this very important announcement. So thank you very much.